What's happened to free speech in Britain?
That's a very big question. We're in a deep hole where freedom of speech is concerned. 30 people a day being arrested in England and Wales for offensive social media posts. People should be free to be as outrageous, even as hateful and as bigoted as they like. So if that's not a free speech crisis, I don't really know what it is. He burnt the Quran, he called Islam a terrorist religion, and it provoked a response. He was attacked by two people, one of which slashed at him with a knife, and he ends up in court. This is insane.
Keir Starmer, you recently compared him to Windows 95. What did you mean by that?
I genuinely don't think he really knows what he thinks about anything. If you're just a glorified manager, it's not going to work.
Is there a point to which the UK is perhaps just ungovernable?
It's quite clear that it needs pretty radical reform.
Yeah. What's the UK's biggest problem that nobody's talking about?
I mean, this is going to sound...
Tom, you're a big free speech campaigner. What's happened to free speech in Britain?
Oh, that's a very big question. I think everyone has noticed now that we're in a deep hole where freedom of speech is concerned. Yeah. Everyone's seen the statistics, 30 people a day being arrested in England and Wales for offensive social media posts, comical stories of people landing on lists of non-crime hate incidents for the most like minor kind of playground insults. And then you get a case like Graham Linehan, the comedy writer, flying back into Heathrow Airport, being confronted by 5 armed police officers, carted off, and originally charged with inciting hate or inciting violence, but later having it downgraded to one of these non-crime hate incidents. Something has gone very wrong when you're arresting comedy writers at airports for telling offensive jokes on Twitter, which was his alleged offence in that case.
It's the sort of thing you see in China, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing now, because for a long time people denied that we had a free speech crisis. But if you're arresting, as I say, just for offensive social media posts, that relates to 2 bits of communication legislation. That's 12,000 people a year. There was a group in America that calculated that's more people than the American state were arresting for speech during the first Red Scare. So if that's not a free speech crisis, I don't really know what it is.
Well, did you see this case in the news this week? Is this guy, he burnt the Quran outside the Turkish consulate, and now there's this rumour that he's in talks with Trump's administration to get refugee status from Britain. I mean, that's how bad it's got, right?
No,
it's just, this sort of stuff is crazy. Islamophobia seems to be one of the big areas where there's still a bit of an omerta, right? You can't really say anything about Islam. Would you say that's generally?
No, I think a bit of an omerta is probably putting it slightly lightly. The one thing that's terrifying around the question of sort of anti-Islamic blasphemy, or however you might want to call it, people burning the Quran, people depicting Muhammad, people saying anything which is deemed to be heretical from the perspective of particularly zealous, extreme Islamic sectarians, is that for a very long time that's been kind of informal. So ever since the Salman Rushdie affair, the fatwa against the author for the satanic verses, you've had the way in which we've like internalized the fatwa, as some people have put it, the way in which people just naturally self-censor where questions of Islam or even Islamism are concerned. What's really concerning about something like the Quran burning case, this gentleman called Hamit Choskan, is that it's now kind of being formalized. So he was burning a Quran outside of the Turkish consulate. He's an Armenian Kurdish asylum seeker, effectively, from Turkey, where he claims that he experienced oppression of the state. And in protest against Erdogan's Turkey, which has taken a slightly more Islamist turn in recent decades, he burnt the Quran, he called Islam a terrorist religion, and it provoked a response. He was attacked by 2 people, one of which slashed at him with a knife, and he ends up in court.
But the guy who slashes the knife gets off, right?
Yeah.
This
is insane. So Hamit Choskan ends up in court for a religiously motivated public order offence. And the wording of the judgment, the original judgment, was incredibly alarming, because it basically said that he was basically doing disorderly conduct, and that was proven by the fact that he was attacked. So it's kind of victim blaming 101, which is quite alarming. He eventually ends up having that overturned on appeal. It's now the day in which we're recording, it's now back in court, and because the CPS are fighting it, we'll see what happens there. But as you say, the man who attacked him, a man called Musa Kadri, he ended up getting basically a slap on the wrist. And if anything, the judge in that case was lavishing him with praise about what a man of good standing he was.
What a hero for slashing that guy who was burning a book.
Exactly. So for a very long time, we've had kind of informal blasphemy codes where Islam and Islamism are concerned. Now they're getting to the point where they're sort of being formalized, but without any law being changed. So it's really alarming how these things can creep in when you least expect them, I suppose.
That's case in Batley as well, Jim, with the grammar school teacher. That was another example of just, what the hell is going on? But police bent over backwards, right? Again, in that case, if I remember rightly.
No, exactly. I mean, I've never seen anyone properly being held legally to account for what was essentially an intimidation campaign. That teacher is still, as far as we know, in hiding, not been able to go back to the school. And you see that pattern repeat itself time and again. Just not too far away from Batley and Wakefield, a few years later, there was this case of these schoolboys who allegedly dropped or scuffed a copy of the Quran that they brought into school. And that culminated in this almost like quasi sort of blasphemy trial in the local masjid, where not only was the one of the boys' mothers there effectively pleading for her son's safety because tempers were flaring at that point, but there was a police representative there who was essentially trying to calm tensions rather than saying, whoa. If any crime has been committed here, it's the people issuing this child and his mother with death threats. And yet that's where the focus is. So I think that tells you everything about where we're at with this issue.
It's insanity. I mean, we'll go back to Islam later because we talk a bit about Labour's. Obviously, they got plans for defining Islamophobia. So we'll go back to that later. Now, if you're enjoying this episode and you want more exclusive content from Daily Expresso, you can go to the description below and subscribe to Daily Express. It's just £1 for your first month. £1. If that's not going to convince you, watch this.
What do you do to relax, Lee?
Oh, good question. Currently trying to master splitting the G. Parliament, it's hard to relax. It's hard to switch off. Sort of a public figure people recognise, and you know it can be a bit much sometimes.
How do the MPs treat you in House of Commons?
You know, you can see what they're thinking.
Yeah,
they're not laughing now.
No,
because I'm still there.
Well, I want to ask you a question now that's going to really get to the heart of who you are as a person.
That's a bit unfair.
It's a bit woke, that is, Lee.
Well, they just like the taste.
It's still woke, mate.
What's all this? You know, they've got the Jesus sandals and shorts on, haven't they? And beards, and that's just the women.
Quick fire. What are your thoughts? Keir Starmer, John Sopel, Robert Jenrick, Kemi Badenoch, David Lammy.
I can't repeat the words. Okay, I will do.
But to go back to your sort of long free speech campaigning, I wonder, has that ever lost you any friends? Has it cost you any opportunities? Or has it been quite good? Maybe. Where would you say that sort of
Well, I think,
down for you?
I mean, I've been at Spite for a very long time, so I'd have to be really outrageous to get cancelled from this particular position. I'd really have to push the boat.
What would you have to say? What would you have to say?
I wouldn't like to speculate.
Yes.
But
I'm not for after the
exactly. I'll tell you afterwards. But so not on that front. And you know, the other thing about freedom of speech is you would think, and in my experience, it's the case that you are not sticking up for the content of what certain people, hotheads, bigots, whatever, are saying. You're sticking up for the principle, and I think most people do get that.
Yeah.
And in a way, making the argument and launching these campaigns, as we at Spite have done on the issue of freedom of speech on university campuses, which we used to do a lot of work on. We did a league table of universities for a long time, toured campuses. We did a lot of campaigning against attempts to muzzle the press via press regulation, as well as just making the case for freedom of speech more broadly in our articles and our documentaries and whatnot. In some ways, making the argument has gotten easier, but in many ways, the general picture has gotten worse. So I think people are more aware and alive to the fact that this is a real problem. They read about it in the newspapers every day. They think it's crazy. Like before you even get into your kind of arguments, philosophical arguments, legal arguments, they're just that this cannot be right. But the reason that people are alive to it is because it's gotten so much worse and it's skyrocketed. So I think maybe it always had to get worse before it would get better. But I do think we're getting to a bit of a turning point where this is concerned, because people are recognising that just on a common sense level, it's mad what's been going on.
That's what we were saying a bit off camera before we started rolling. You know, we met 10 years ago back in the sort of height of the campus. Yeah. You know, cancelling saga where wearing a sombrero basically got you on Interpol's most wanted list, or, you know, all that sort of mad stuff's going on. It does feel like there's been a bit of a sea change in the sort of wider culture. Obviously, legally, you're correct. Like, there's a lot of persecutions of people for nonsense stuff, but it does feel like the world has changed a bit. Have you noticed a shift, do you think, in terms of the general public away from woke towards a sort of more sensible?
I think so. I think the public have remained on this issue, as on many others, very commonsensical, very switched on, and also just on a very basic level, I think people in this country don't like the whiff of tyranny, even if it is just a whiff. So I think that's really put them off. I think the problem is that many of our institutions, whether that's the law, whether that's politicians, whether that's universities, whether that's just corporate culture more broadly, has kind of remained still pretty intolerant. There's been a bit of a vibe shift in some of those places in the last couple of years. A lot of people have written about it. It feels like the high watermark of woke cancellations that we saw in the wake of BLM 2020. It was a high watermark, and it's kind of receded since then. But I think that's going to remain pretty entrenched. So I think the story on freedom of speech is kind of the story on many issues, which is that the public have got their head screwed on. They know that you should be pretty live and let live, that people should be able to have their own opinions. It's just woven into all of our kind of even just sayings, sticks and stones, or everyone's entitled to an opinion. Everyone gets this.
Yes.
But you have a lot of institutions who have imbibed a very authoritarian, identitarian view of the world, which in their view necessitates censorship. So that's the I guess the kind of schism or the gap that we need to bridge here.
And it feels like it's not just the sort of powerful public institutions, right? We were talking a bit previously about the arts.
Yeah.
Right, Theatreland, Hollywood, they still seem to be stuck in that kind of mid 2010s era of very liberal, very woke, very sort of holier than thou. Why do you think they failed to move on? With some notable exceptions, Top Gun Maverick maybe springs to mind, but there are some notable exceptions. But why do you think they've been so slow to catch up with public mood?
I think it's a difficult one. I think partly a big part of the story with the way in which identity politics, woke culture, whatever you want to call it, capture these institutions so easily is because it tended to come from a very specific kind of person, people who went to a certain kind of university, people from a particular social class background. It's very much the domain of the upper middle classes, people who, generally speaking, didn't have much problems in their life, so they would seek them elsewhere and, willful offence taking, as well as the fact that these are people who went through elite universities where these ideologies were inculcated into them, the idea that speech is violence, the idea that the worst thing you could possibly do is have a forthright debate about certain thorny issues, because otherwise you risk stirring up the public or you risk causing division or what have you. They just take that as read. And I think the arts is a particularly difficult case. I think what's interesting and is the fact that I think cultural institutions that are have to be slightly more receptive to the paying public tend to have caught up a little bit more quickly, shall we say.
Yes.
But maybe those who are more in receipts of arts funding, slightly more insulated foundations and so on, are going to be slower to catch up. Maybe that's part of the picture. But you do look around some of the scandals and debates that kick off and you think it's like 2015 called it once its talking points back. Do you not have you not got to know?
Yeah, come on guys, get with the program. Get with the program. You've had a bit of a run in with the arts and cancellation recently with your documentary. Heard about this wild story. Do you want to tell our viewers what happened? They probably haven't heard of it.
Yeah, so we produced a documentary called Think Before You Post, which was about what we were touching on at the beginning. People who had their collars felt were arrested, in some cases even prosecuted for social media posts. We spoke to a handful of people who had been through this themselves, as well as some experts and campaigners in the field who've been pushing back against this. People might have read about some of these examples. There was a couple in Borehamwood who were arrested, held for hours on end and investigated for complaining about their child's school in a WhatsApp group and the school taking offence. There was a soldier in South Wales who was arrested after the Southport stabbings for supposedly inciting racial hatred. He was held on remand for 17 days and then acquitted in almost exactly the same amount of time, in minutes. And Alison Pearson of the Daily Telegraph, who got a knock at her door for a non-crime hate incident. So these big cases, and we wanted to tell the story and to give people a sense of what it feels like to receive that knock on the door and to be dragged through the courts when you've done nothing wrong. In all cases, they ended up being let off, but after a heavy ordeal. So long story short, we make this documentary, we put it out on YouTube and all the usual places, and we thought, let's hold a premiere so we can have a little panel discussion. Anyone who's subscribed to Spiked and has helped make the film happen, it'd be a nice evening out for them as well as us. We booked the Rich Mix, which is a cinema / kind of cultural centre in Bethnal Green in East London. And everything was absolutely fine. We were ready to go. I believe it was the week of the event itself. We'd already we'd sent them over the files. Everything was gone. We'd announced the speakers. All that was all fine. And we just got an email saying that because our film did not align with the values of the Rich Mix, they would be unable to hold it. I'm not sure what those values are.
Well,
not freedom of speech.
Not freedom of speech. Yeah. So they cancelled a film about cancellation. Yeah.
Which I really didn't think they would be dumb enough to do, to be perfectly frank.
Well,
I mean, maybe the guy who sent, I don't assume it's a guy. In fact, I know it's a guy because he had his pronouns in his email signature.
Of course.
So maybe that betrays something about
first sign.
The politics there. I wouldn't be me to say. And people might think, did you not guess this would happen? Genuinely, I'd attended pro-Brexit events at that venue before. We really thought it'd be fine. We thought it'd be a great place to show it. And we were flabbergasted when they turned around. But as ever, I think it backfired on them as much as anything else. Because I think for you to be the cultural institution that shut down the free speech film, it's just not a good look, is it?
It just looks terrible. It looks terrible. I mean, we've had to organise events and stuff, and it's an absolute nightmare when stuff gets cancelled last minute. What did you do when it was cancelled? You still got it on the road, right?
We did. We were determined to to still do it because people had bought tickets, people were coming from out of town. We were looking forward to the event itself, and also we got a lot of publicity off the back of it. So we wanted to make sure that it still went ahead. So we ended up finding an alternative venue not too far away. Wasn't unfortunately the full kind of cinema experience that we were after, but we managed to screen the film. Our supporters got to see it. We got to have our panel discussion, so all was well in the end. But having to do that, especially when anyone who tries to organise events knows what a nightmare it is for all kinds of reasons.
Expensive.
It's expensive.
When you go to an event last minute, it's suddenly the average rate gets jacked up.
Exactly, let alone all the other stuff you have to deal with. So yeah, it did go ahead in the end, and I suppose it proved our point.
It
There's
did very
a
aptly.
problem with this.
Well, we saw the documentary when that happened. So they say it backfired absolutely spectacularly. Probably more people saw it as a result. Tricky question, maybe. Where do you draw the line between free speech and genuine harm, or do you draw a line?
Well, this is the crucial question, really, because I think we've got ourselves into such a muddle because we haven't had to think about these questions. We've chosen not to think about these questions for a very long time. I think it's relatively simple insofar as there is speech and then there is crimes that involve speech. So people should be free to be as outrageous, even as hateful and as bigoted as they like. I really think that's quite important, not because I have any truck with those kinds of views, but who decides what is hateful? That if you would give the state that power, I think you might suddenly find that what they think is hateful is not that hateful at all.
No.
So that's very important on the point of not getting on the slippery slope, as it were. But it's also, if you want to challenge hatred, it's not obvious to me at all that silencing it is the way to do that. And I think history proves that point. So then, but when it comes to people who are directly inciting violence, I don't think that's a free speech issue. When people are in the same, that's when speech kind of crosses the line from just the expression of ideas or sentiments or what have you into trying to commission and to encourage and to spark imminent lawless action. So what I would go back to, or what I would promote, is the standard that they have in America, which is to say you have freedom of speech. Incitement to violence does not count, and that is defined incredibly tightly over there. It's speech which is both likely and intended to cause imminent lawless action. Something resembling that, I think, would get us out of this muddle pretty quickly, and allow for a point where we're not having to constantly argue the toss over individual cases. We have a very bright line and we stick to it, I think.
Yeah. Speaking, you brought up obviously the difficulty of institutions trying to define what isn't acceptable speech. Ties in nicely with what Labour's doing with Islamophobia. They're hard at work, aren't they, trying to define what Islamophobia is exactly. How worried are you about that?
It's really alarming. I mean, this would be essentially a kind of definition that would be imposed on councils and various bodies. Wouldn't be a statute per se, but it would still have a huge chilling effect. Not least because we know that bogus accusations of Islamophobia have chilled discussions of some incredibly serious things. I mean, would the grooming gang scandal have gotten out of hand to the degree that it did if there wasn't so much sensitivity about the particular profile of the Pakistani Muslim men who were disproportionately involved in those horrific crimes? So the idea that after that, which happened in many Labour areas, of course, we should remember, as Labour councils seemingly looked the other way, to add an extra layer of concern about offence and so on seems to be absolutely disastrous. They have been pushed back to a certain extent. They began talking about this being an Islamophobia definition, which anyone who's looked into this is a bogus term promoted by Islamists in the main to try and ring fence their activities as well as Islam itself from criticism. They're talking more now about kind of anti-Muslim hatred, which is at least slightly more clarifying. But I think anything in this area is bound to chill freedom of speech and to kind of put us further on that road towards more formally criminalising blasphemy in general, but anti-Islamic blasphemy in particular. There are already voices within the Labour Party who have stood up and essentially made the case that this needs to happen for the sake of multicultural harmony. So really, really alarming. And it's just one of those things where this is just in the DNA of the Labour Party, I think. That mix of censorship and multicultural sensitivity, it's really, really lethal.
Is it like a cynical electoral thing? If we're going to sort of be real about it, is it just the fact that, in places like West Streeting's constituency, they won narrowly because he had like a, pro-Palestine candidate standing, and they're worried about the Muslim vote? Do you think that's what this is about slightly?
Well, it could well be. I think that it'd be ridiculous to completely dispel that.
No.
I don't. At the same time, there has been discussion in this area for quite a long time.
Yeah.
This particular definition basically comes off of the back of a working group trying to come up with an Islamophobia definition. probably coming up on 10 years ago now. So this is something, a panel incidentally in which Wes Streeting himself sat on at the time before his majority was quite as slim as it is now. So maybe it's one of those things where this has been kind of percolating through. And I think it is the culmination, not just of Labour having more problems with the quote-unquote Muslim vote in many of their constituencies, but just a general shift within our politics, which has convinced itself that for the sake of multicultural harmony, we need to reintroduce kind of 7th century restrictions on the criticism or mockery of religion. That's where we've ended up. I think there's a longer tail to that rather than just the last few years, I suppose. I
was wondering if you feel if there's the same sort of trend going on with, there's a lot of debate around anti-Semitism at the minute. You've probably seen in America on the right, there's this quite interesting debate emerging. People like Tucker Carlson are saying, claiming it's impossible to criticize, say, Israel without being dubbed an anti-Semite. Obviously, we've seen some of these people on these marches. They are just, cut and thrust. There's no debate. They are anti-Semites. Yeah. But do you think there's a bit of a danger there as well of just sort of labelling anyone who's critical of Israel as an anti-Semite?
Oh, no, absolutely. If anyone who just is concerned about the plight of the Gazan people, the Palestinian people, anyone who wants to protest against the actions of the IDF or the actions of the Israeli government, of course, they're entirely within their rights to do so. That's not what we're talking about, though. When we talk about the problems with these, we're talking about people on the streets of London chanting ancient Arabic war slogans about the slaughter of Jews, the Khaybar chant. You're talking about people holding up images of Benjamin Netanyahu or various Israeli politicians
as puppets controlling
all the old tropes, puppet master, devil horns, eating children. These are ancient caricatures and tropes which have just been projected onto Israel and presented as anti-Zionist rather than anti-Semitic when we all know what is there. I don't think people should be criminalised for being anti-Semitic. No. I don't think people should be criminalised for any opinion. But can we at least get it right that what we're talking about here is not people saying, I am concerned about Palestinians, or I do not like this particular Israeli government. I want to protest and raise my voice on that fact. You're talking about people dealing with some real protocols of the elders of Zion stuff on the streets of London week after week after week. So whatever we choose to do about this question, I think the answer is not more censorship.
No.
Let's at least accept that that's what's going on.
Yes, no, completely agree. Final question was free speech. Do you worry that Britain is quietly slipping towards a sort of soft, polite, very British form of authoritarianism?
I think we're sort of already there, aren't we? I mean, this is what's really alarming is that this has been happening for many years. I mean, essentially, we've been engaged in about a 60-year experiment with trying to police hate in particular. It begins with the Racial Relations Act. It introduces this idea of incitement to racial hatred. You have the kind of piling up of various pieces of legislation in the years since, incitement to religious hatred coming into play. You have, in the early 2000s, this really terrible combination of kind of communications offences, trying to crack down on grossly offensive speech, plus the rise of social media. Those two things put together is what has led to the thousands and thousands of arrests, because you have more and more people able to express themselves on these platforms than ever before, and waiting on the shelf this very illiberal pieces of legislation. So it's been very long in the making. But as we were talking about earlier, I think now is the point at which there is an opportunity really to roll it back. I noticed that the two prominent parties on the right of British politics, both the Conservatives and Reform, are really making this an issue. It's also the sort of thing where it's not particularly difficult to repeal this kind of thing. It's not something which is going to involve major reform of an institution. It's just saying we were no longer going to arrest people for, making disparaging comments about the pride flag on Facebook, as has actually happened. And that is something which was almost unimaginable, because up until quite recently, this issue, even if a politician, whether they be left, right, or whatever, might privately think, on principle, this isn't a good idea, it just wasn't a live political issue. That's changed. So I think there's prospects for rolling it back, even though it does feel like we're in a pretty bad place at the moment.
It certainly does. I know our viewers agree. Leave your comments. Tell us what you think. Moving on to UK politics, you went viral about 3-4 months ago, didn't you? You were on the BBC, right?
They do occasionally let me on there.
They do occasionally let you on. Yeah, they have to, balancing. It's only a good bit of diversity, actually. You went viral. You had an argument with Zack Polanski, of all people. What happened there?
Yeah, that was good. I was excited to do that one because it was the day after he'd been elected Green Party leader. We'd actually debated each other before at the Cambridge Union, so I met him before. So I was looking forward to a good tangle. It was also the day after, kind of going full circle here a bit, that Graham Linehan had been arrested, or certainly the week in which he had been arrested at Heathrow for making some jokes about transgender ideology, and it was quite eye-opening because even at the time, all party leaders, or at least all major politicians, including the Labour Party, were at least admitting this has gone a bit far. But Zack basically completely supported the move to arrest him. But it was a good exchange of views, and I think it kind of made clear that Greenism, or this new Green Party, is pretty authoritarian to its core, and also has a completely unhinged policy when it comes to the economy and the environment. That we probably already knew. But yes, it's been fascinating to see his star rise so much more since then.
Well, he just keeps going viral and viral and viral again, doesn't he?
He does.
I mean,
sometimes for good reasons, for reasons that his supporters like, and sometimes because he's
gone a bit off the
backside
rails.
handed to him.
Yes, more often than not. Were any awkward words exchanged in the green room afterwards, or was it all hunky-dory?
It's all very cordial. I mean, he was busy that day. He kind of had to swoop straight in and swoop straight out as is often the way, because he's probably did like 10 media interviews or whatever. But these things are often cool. And this is one thing.
He seems a nice enough guy.
I'm sure he is.
Yeah.
Again, I've only ever had two quite when the lights or the cameras aren't on, quite brief conversations with him. But yes, it was surprisingly cordial.
Can you see a world in which demographics change, the younger generation become sort of majority voter, and there's a world in which maybe, God forbid, the Green Party is running the UK?
I mean, anything could happen now. I think that's one. This is why I think anyone who tries to make predictions these days
is a fool,
because everything's so much more volatile. That's just the story of our time. For the best part of a century, we've had a stable two-party system in which both Labour and the Conservatives could count on roughly at least a third of the electorate. It was rooted in class and the clear kind of economic divisions in the country. All of that's broken down, particularly since Brexit. And so it's created space for political entrepreneurs, upstarts, new parties, older parties, which have been revamped under new leadership. So anything could happen. I think the thing that I would warn against, though, is that this Green Party, particularly under this leadership, but it's been going this way for some time now, is such a kind of regressive and reactionary force. I know it poses as very progressive, and it poses as quite cuddly, and obviously it cares about the environment, and it supposedly cares about minorities. But on top of the insane environmental policies, like one thinking that if anything, this government isn't pursuing net zero fast enough, like we've got to really hurry up and impoverish working class Britain and make their energy prices even more expensive.
Don't touch North Sea oil.
Exactly. Yeah. Terrible idea. Even though we're, 1% of global emissions, let's impoverish ourselves unilaterally just to make Zack Polanski and his friends feel better.
Meanwhile, India's just chucking coal on the fire like it's
everyone. I think everyone is starting to realise this is insane. But then there's also the broader questions. There's the authoritarianism, which seems to be just in the DNA of any supposedly left-wing movement these days, and also where the Green Party are concerned, since the Israel-Gaza war, have really lent into a kind of Israelophobia, which is leading to some quite questionable characters ending up in and around their party. There was a Times investigation in the run-up to the 2024 election, which found, if memory serves, about 20 candidates who had engaged in not just anti-Israel speech, but very, very questionable speech. There's one example which comes to mind, which is it was one of their candidates, I forget where, who online had praised a pro-Palestine march which disrupted a Holocaust Remembrance Day event at Auschwitz.
Jesus Christ.
And this was one of their diversity coordinators, incidentally. This is really quite well. I mean, obviously we see this, we saw this in Corbyn's Labour, we see this in your party, you see that even in and around the Labour Party from time to time, candidates having to be stood down because they've said that October the 7th was a false flag operation or what have you. But this is really at the core of what is supposedly left-wing politics now. And that's something that I would say certainly should guard against anyone thinking that this is a movement that you want to get behind.
It's very strange that these characters have come up in the left-wing movement over especially the last couple of decades. You sort of think back to Labour in maybe I wasn't alive then, even though I look it, 70s, 80s.
It's the moustache, I think, more than anything else.
Yeah, don't comment on the moustache again. I got absolutely roasted yesterday. I've had enough. These characters like Dennis Healey, your Tony Benns, those kind of characters, even some sort of like people who would be pro-Brexit today, goes from this very working class, union-led movement for the people who've actually done a decent day's work in their life to Keir Starmer, Zack Polanski, and these nut jobs you've been talking about. How do you think this came about? Why has there been that huge shift on the left?
I think, well, first of all, I think there's a direct relationship between the political left and the working class separating, and how mad the left has become. It's like they've been kind of freed from the civilizing influence of ordinary people, and so they've been going down some very crazy rabbit holes ever since then. There's obviously a clear history to this. I mean, we've been talking about this explicitly since Brexit, because of the fact that you had a Labour Party not only campaign for Remain when the working classes voted pretty emphatically for Leave, but also tried to overturn their vote. I think that was the point in which the connection between the Labour Party and the working class was, even though it had been fraying for a very long time,
died.
Just was severed. And it might be the case, as in the last election, that a Labour Party can claw some of those votes back. But the idea that they can count on them, the idea that they are their base from which they build out, I think that has completely changed now. There's all kinds of different aspects to this. It's the way in which, you know, the left has become an increasingly middle class movement, the way in which the Labour Party has become the kind of political wing of lawyers and third sector workers and people who used to work at different layers of the Labour Party, whereas previously it was seen as a way in which trade unionists or people who were once on the shop floor could not just have a voice and a vote, but actually be in Parliament. That's one thing. There's constant talk about how diverse Parliament is and how representative Parliament is in comparison to previous years. I mean, this Labour Party likes to talk about the fact that it's got so many more state school educated people in there. But if you look at, in terms of the jobs people used to do before they entered Parliament, working class representation has crashed, and the trend is really undeniable. And it's almost entirely down to the fact that the Labour Party is now full of people like Keir Starmer or like much of the cabinet, who, even if they come from relatively modest beginnings to begin with, tend to have gone through the kind of meritocratic elite university route, where, as Maurice Glassman likes to say, they go to university and get stupid. So it's that thing where even where there are a few people who might have come from those origins, they no longer really have, shall we say, the kind of full sense for the class interest which used to inform them. So there's all kinds of different reasons for this, but I think on the left in general, there's just been a sense that working class people have been a terrible letdown, because they refuse to align with their views, because they refuse to go along with their increasingly deranged ideas, whether it's around the environment or whether it's around identity. And I think what's fascinating now is that it's not just that they previously might have had to tolerate these people, they felt like, but now they're actually openly disdainful of them. That's happened.
They feel
Brexit,
liberated, essentially. They've got their sort of charity sector base in London, Bristol, Manchester, wherever, and they're happy with that now, right? They don't want to know. And like you say, with these sort of all state school shortlists and stuff, it just feels deeply patronising. As someone who went to a state school, like, we don't need the help.
Me as well. I mean, it's exactly the idea that's one thing about the Labour Party is, even when they try to talk about class, or they try to talk about where you went to school or whatever, they still approach it as if it's its own kind of identity category. Yeah. Like, in this really patronising fashion, in this really kind of, you need a leg up, you need these shortlists, otherwise it would be impossible for you to make the way through. It's so patronising, and also it's also a problem with, you should be selecting for merit. The cream rises to the top. Everyone knows this, and the idea that it requires that kind of level of intervention in order to get there is just deeply.
There's no connection with the real world. I mean, I came from a comprehensive school, didn't do particularly well, and now I'm doing, I would say, all right for myself in a media company, an industry that's traditionally considered quite cloistered, middle class. We just don't need the help they imagine they do. Same with the all-women shortlists. Just deeply patronising, right? Moving on to Keir Starmer. You recently compared him to Windows 95. What did you mean by that exactly?
I'm running out of defective pieces of equipment to like him to. So if anyone remembers Windows 95, you used to have to reboot it a lot. So that was
brief overlap. I think I was more of a 97 kid. But
But I think 95 was the first one I vaguely remember. So yes, this came in the context of him having his 407th reset in the wake of Morgan McSweeney and Chris Wormell's departure. And I just thought that was really telling. I mean, he's only been in power 19 months, and the fact that he keeps having to restart himself, as I say, like a defective piece of machinery, is very, very telling. And I think it comes down to the fact that if you don't know what you're for, then it's very difficult to do anything in power. Keir Starmer tried to make a virtue out of being a technocrat, out of being a kind of managerialist, about saying we've had hot air and testy debates about all these issues, but now you're going to have a government which is just going to get the job done, which will have the civil service in tow and will deliver. It was all very mission driven. I've got these missions which will be measured against these milestones, which will be rooted in these foundations. So anyone remembers these absurd speeches he used to give. I think what we found out is, first of all, both a lot of people in and around him are very inept, as is the civil service. I think Labour were incredibly naive to think that the reason that the Tories struggled to get things done, even if they wanted to do them, was that they were just feckless, or the civil service was resisting it for good reasons. But as soon as they get in, because these are like their people, everything will be fine. They're now finding, as many ministers do, that you pull a lever and nothing happens, or you pull a lever and the opposite thing as you intended happens. But also because Keir Starmer generally doesn't really believe in very much at all. He has a few things historically he's been attached to, international law, human rights law, because of his professional background. Beyond that, there's really very little there. the only kind of consistent political view I can detect of his is that he would quite like to be prime minister. And then now that he got there, it's like the dog that caught the car. It doesn't know what to do now.
Yeah.
And if you think about any of the positions he's taken, he campaigned for the Labour leadership, saying that we should defend free movement, signing up to self-ID pledges around transgender ideology, so on and so forth, saying he would essentially be kind of Jeremy Corbyn, but a bit more pragmatic and able to put it on time and sing the national anthem. And then he just U-turned on those things one after another. And then but I think what that was clear was people said, okay, this is because this is just the sort of Blairite heart of Keir Starmer asserting himself. I don't think it's necessarily that. I genuinely don't think he really knows what he thinks about anything. There's no proper political philosophy. You read the insider accounts, people will openly say he has very little hinterland whatsoever, doesn't seem to read, doesn't seem to think very deeply about things. And I think you can't just have a kind of project manager PM, particularly at a time when there are really big crises confronting us that requires new thinking, radical change, bringing the country with you to try and remedy some of these problems, economic, social, what have you. If you're just a glorified manager,
mid-manager,
it's not going to work.
There's a standard corporate mid-manager or exactly. I mean, I read an extraordinary piece in The Spectator, the Tim Shipman piece. And do you see that bit where he mentioned that he doesn't work from Friday evening through to Monday morning, as if the PM is a Monday, Friday, 9-5 job? Is it any wonder he's got no grip on the country, right? It's just unbelievable. You touched on the civil service and the difficulty of getting Whitehall just to, frankly, do anything of worth. You're all right about Keir Starmer, but is there a point to which the UK is perhaps just ungovernable at this point?
Well, I think it's quite clear that it needs pretty radical reform, and this is something that people have been talking about for some time. I mean, even back in the New Labour years, there was a recognition that this supposedly Rolls-Royce civil service was no such thing. It was barely a Ford Fiesta at that point. I mean, it was quite, even then it was clear that something had gone very, very wrong. And Blair himself talked about it. What's happened since then is, I think Brexit made it impossible to ignore, because you essentially had a policy, huge strategic kind of policy shift, which clearly most people who worked in the civil service, certainly at the top end, thought was disastrous and dangerous and quasi-fascistic and resisted it at every turn. And also, obviously, Dominic Cummings, former right-hand man to Boris Johnson, has been very interesting about how, just on a quite fundamental level, the incentives are all screwed up. You've got people who continue to fail upwards within the civil service, the impossibility of sacking people, even if they're terrible. These are people who should be guided by a sense of public service and also serving the will of the government, which is democratically elected. And yet there are all these perverse incentives that guard against them delivering on what people are put there to do, and also just allow for a lot more ineptitude and blufferism and just general dysfunction. I think it is certainly resolvable, but I think any political party who wants to get in and actually change things, that has to be a core part of what they do now. Because it doesn't matter how many voters you convince that this is the way forward. If you cannot actually execute, then you're going to be on a hiding to nothing. And also voters could become much more demoralised, because they could put their faith in a upstart party or a new type of leader and find that they too are thwarted or can't get anything done. And that could be really, really dangerous for our politics.
That's what my worry is a bit with Farage. Very great guy, like sort of great guy. Seems like he'd be a fresh face, real different type of leader, one we've not had in decades. But do you think he can revive the country? Do you think he can grapple with all these massive issues you talk about, Dominic Cummings has talked about? Do you think he's got a chance? Or
well, I think reform have got to convince a lot of people that they are capable of laying out a comprehensive set of policies, and also a team of people who seem ready and capable to properly execute them. And I think the jury's still out on that front. So I think they have made significant moves in that respect. There's obviously a lot of discussion about some of the more frontline politicians, your Suella Bravermans and your Robert Jenricks, who've made the move over, but more so the kind of people behind closed doors, or the people who are brought in, people like Danny Kruger, to focus more on the question of legislation and policy and so on, I think shows that they recognise that's something that they have to sort out. But obviously we're still probably a fair way from an election, although who knows these days. We'll see in time whether or not they actually have the answers, because I think what a lot of people are turning to them, certainly if you listen to the pollsters and the focus groupers, not because they're completely 100% convinced that this is the right way, but because we've tried everything else and now we're going to, now we should try this. Obviously they agree with what they're saying on many questions, but I think people in the public remain waiting for a few more answers there as to what could get us out of all of this.
No, certainly. I mean, today's announcement on their shadow cabinet put some of those fears to bed, maybe raise new fears.
Yeah. Depending on your preferences.
Depending on your preferences, yeah, exactly. We talked about the left earlier, with all of its factions and its cranks and its sort of oddballs. I wonder if is there a bit of a danger of the new right leaning in the same direction. We've had, Advance UK have emerged. We had Ben Habib in the studio. I'd like to say he's a great guy, really nice guy. Not a problem with him at all personally. But I wonder with projects like Advance UK, like Restore Britain, Rupert Lowe's new project, are these just vanity projects that are going to split the vote on the right?
It's difficult to tell, and I think we'll find out how much support they pick up. I mean, it seems that Restore Britain, which is Rupert Lowe's kind of political movement, which has now been turned into a fully fledged political party or kind of umbrella party for all kinds of other local ones. It seems like, from what I understand, Advance UK are going to merge into that. So we'll see what happens there. I, though generally speaking, think that both Advance and Restore, and they're now coming together, are a product of a mindset on the right, which is that X is Britain, in exactly the same way that 10 or 15 years ago, the left convinced itself that Twitter was Britain. Before we even get into some of the criticisms that people around Restore and Rupert Lowe have been making of reform, thus necessitating this new venture, supposedly, it's just a simple fact that, first and foremost, whilst there is a lot of support for Rupert Lowe on social media, he's got north of 600,000 Twitter followers, I believe, when he was pushed out of reform in quite shady circumstances, I think that's fair to say, last year, there was a poll by JL Partners who essentially asked voters if they knew who he was. They even prompted with an image. 86% of voters had no idea who he was. 71% of reform voters had no idea who he was. So at the very least, this should caution against the being too optimistic, as many people on social media are right now, saying he's going to be our next Prime Minister and so on. It reminded me a bit of the 2015 election, which I think must have been the first one that I covered, where Owen Jones was convinced that Labour had the election in the bag because Russell Brand had Ed Miliband on his YouTube channel.
This. Yeah, the sort of the real seal of doom. That
exactly. And in a sense, it's even crazier to think that Rupert Lowe will be the next Prime Minister because, at least everyone at that time pretty much knew who Ed Miliband and Russell Brand were. So again, I think there's a problem with tremendous groupthink, and there's also, it's fair to say, a lot of energy around Restore, which is pretty murky. And not that this reflects the views of Rupert Lowe himself, but there's clearly, it's attracted a lot of attention from people who don't just want a party that is going to get control of the borders, deal with illegal migration, so on and so forth, but is essentially interested in deporting anyone who isn't white British. So he hasn't said anything of that nature himself, but you can certainly see that people are kind of latching onto that movement for those reasons. And I think any movement that becomes associated with that, whether that's fair or unfair, will become electoral kryptonite, personally, because I think whilst people in this country are really fed up with the immigration question, they're really fed up with wokery, they're really fed up with identity politics. They don't want identity politics and authoritarianism in the other direction.
There is
what
still
some
a line.
of these influencers are promoting, I suppose.
Exactly. There's still a line. You sort of talk to reform voters and you ask them about Tommy Robinson, say, and they kind of go, yeah, I wouldn't want him in the party. There is a line, right? These people are commonsensical, they're practical, they're not woke, but there's still very much a line, right? Final question. What's the UK's biggest problem that nobody's talking about?
Oh, I hate these questions.
Sorry, mate.
No. I mean, this is going to sound kind of... In a way, I think the big problems that it's not that we're not talking about them, but we're not really talking about them with the right seriousness, if that makes sense.
Right.
The fact that we could quite easily be teetering on the edge of a debt crisis is something that doesn't really get discussed. I mean, it comes up from time to time in a way that, in the sort of, business or economic pages of a newspaper. But the fact that that's a real possibility, if we're not careful, is something that doesn't really happen. Similarly with the geopolitical picture, you've got the Labour Party running around trying to do some creative accounting to make it look like we might be actually able to spend a little bit more on defence. Meanwhile, the welfare bill continues to soar and so on and so forth. But the fact that we do live in quite clearly much more unstable times in which the sort of end of history and the peace dividend and all that seems to be a thing of the distant past, I'm always quite struck by the fact that that's not a conversation that we're having a little bit more seriously. Not because I'm, got any glee for either of those, for things to go really south on either of those two fronts. And I think you need pretty serious statesmen to emerge to deal with the economic picture and to deal with the geopolitical picture in such a way that avoids the worst thing happening. But I'm always struck by the fact that we're still talking about SW1, Westminster sort of dog and pony show stuff, whereas there are much bigger questions that are confronting us at the moment. And that, if we're honest, the politicians haven't got much of an answer to right now.
On that positive note, Tom, thanks for coming in and brightening the place up a bit.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, our pleasure, our pleasure. Look, if you enjoyed that episode, hit like and subscribe below. Don't forget to ring the bell as well, because you'll never miss an episode. Until next time, thank you very much.